It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Last week, the talks for the reunification of Cyprus had reached a crisis point. But on Sunday, June 4th, the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, affirmed that all sides had at least agreed that the chapter on security guarantees were of vital importance to the two communities. Just by way of giving you some background to all of this, in 1974, the island of Cyprus was divided by a coup against the Archbishop at the time, Makarios. Following the coup, ethnic violence led to a Turkish invasion of the northern part of the island. Both the Turkish military and the Greek paramilitaries conducted massacres on the island and, of course, ethnic cleansing that went along with it. The Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus declared its independence, but Turkey is the only country in the world which recognizes it as a state. Only 300,000 people live in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, and about 1.4 million live in the Republic of Cyprus, which is the southern part of the island, yet the island holds a great significance to regional politics. Why? We are about to find out. For that discussion, I'm joined by Leandros Fischer. Leandros gave us some of this context in an analytical interview we had done with him when these talks began, and we'll put a link to that on the right side of this player. Dr. Leandros Fischer is a political scientist, currently a research associate at the Cyprus University of Technology. Dr. Leandros, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Dr. Fischer, let's start off this interview by just telling us there was a lot of media coverage this past week that indicating that this is once in a lifetime chance to achieve peace between divided Cyprus. Why is that?
Well, the formula of once in a lifetime chance to reach peace is always said at every round of negotiations for the last 40 years. I would say that in the last years, in this final round of negotiation, it is widely acknowledged that this is something like a last chance, because should the talks collapse, we would be seeing something like the formalization of the status quo of the island in its division between a Greek south and a Turkish north that you previously mentioned. So one possible scenario after a collapse of the talks would be for the northern part of the island to gain some sort of international upgrade in its legal status, maybe some kind of Taiwan-like arrangement, which means normal commercial links and trade links with the rest of the world, stopping short of formal international recognition. The other possibility that might arise from a collapse of the talks is that the Republic of Cyprus will engage in the same kind of legal warfare that it's engaged for in the last 40 years, trying, that is, to prevent any sort of recognition of the Turkish Cypriot rule north of the island. But I think that's a scenario which will not be very successful given the regional balance of power, and it could also interact with the current instability in Turkey, and there might be some kind of conflagration in the region, some kind of a heightening of geopolitical tension. Or, I don't want to be too pessimistic, there might be a short deadlock in the talks which will be overturned when another Greek Cypriot leadership is elected, which is far more open into making compromises, or conversely, if Turkey exhibits a more conciliatory attitude. But those two chances, these two possibilities are quite distant from the present that we are now. So we are looking, I think, mostly at a formalization of some sort of division.
Why is there a lot of hype about Cyprus? I mean, what is the strategic importance and significance of the talks? That's one question. And the other, if you may follow, why did it come to a deadlock last week?
I would rather answer your second question first, because I think the second question leads better to the first one. So there are two ways of looking at the reasons why the talks have collapsed. If you want to look at the micro level and at the level of negotiations between very important people, I would say that there was a series of incidents which kind of provoked the collapse of the talks. First and foremostly, the Greek Cypriot parliament voted this law in, which requires schools in the south to commemorate the anniversary of the 1950 referendum held among the Greeks of the island, which demanded union with Greece. So this is not really the controversial part of the story. The controversial part was that this law was actually submitted by an openly neo-fascist organization, which is the sister party of Golden Dawn in Greece. And the most scandalous part was that the only party that voted against this measure was the left-wing Agel party, and the party of President Nikos Anastasiadis, which is considered to be a moderate pro-solution party, basically abstained from the vote in order to sort of hang on to its nationalist electorate. So this predictably provoked an interruption of the talks, a suspension by the talks by the Turkish Cypriot leader, Mr. Mustafa Akinci. And I would place these moves in a series of deliberate moves by Anastasiadis to lead the talks into a deadlock so that he can focus on his electoral campaign, because we have elections in February 2013 in the south, which means that Anastasiadis is trying to gain the nationalist vote to strengthen his position, and he's hoping to, in this way, postpone the talks, or at least if the talks collapse, avoid the blame for the talks. Something which is very highly unlikely, because I think that his maneuvering has been pretty transparent in the eyes of the UN. So this is why you have this announcement recently at New York, where Anastasiadis has somehow backtracked and agreed to a restart of the talks. So this is the one reason. But in my opinion, I think the politicking on the micro level isn't as important as the wider regional context, and it has to do with the significance of Cyprus that you just mentioned. So Cyprus is strategically vital for any regional power and any global power. It houses a lot of British and American surveillance installations and air bases. And it's also in the middle of a geopolitical rivalry between Greece and Turkey, which is increasing in the last months. And this must also be viewed in conjunction with geopolitical flux which exists in the region. So, in my personal opinion, I think all the things that I mentioned before for the reasons why the talks have collapsed are more or less alibis, because in this current climate of economical crisis, we have a crisis regime in the south which is staring into a very uncertain future. And we have the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, which is virtually a parody of a state. It's only recognized by Turkey. And now no side can afford to gamble a lot. So I think that for both of the ruling classes on the island, I think the collapse of the talks or their postponement is actually a way to cover the real reasons for the collapse of the talks from the deadlock, which are very structural in nature and are actually regionally embedded.
Now, of course, Greece is going through a financial crisis and a debt crisis and an almost existential crisis in the sense of its survival of its people through this horrendous austerity measures that's going on. Turkey, on the other hand, quite involved in what's going on in the Middle East, Syria in particular, also trying to flex their muscles. And on top of all of this, I understand there's been some gas reserves found just outside of the island in its surrounding waters, also leading to further tensions in the region in terms of divvying up all of this and the tensions between Greece and the island, and of course Turkey and the island. So give us a little bit of an explanation of that, and a short one at that, because we are running out of time.
I think a short explanation is not quite possible, but I'm going to try to be as brief as possible on this one. There are natural gas reserves in the coastal under the sea shelf of Cyprus. And the bottom line is that Turkey is opposed to any kind of exploration by the Republic of Cyprus, because it claims that the Cypriot state does not formally exist after the intercommunal violence of the 60s. The Republic of Cyprus is actively engaged in exploration and has also signed a lot of license agreements with multinational corporations. And there is, of course, also the general flux in the region. Both sides are very proactive. Turkey is engaging in very aggressive rhetoric towards Greece, centered on its territorial claims on some islands in the Aegean. But Greece is also very proactive by engaging in military alliances with Israel or with Egypt in an effort to contain Turkey. But on the other side, that you have states like Israel, which are kind of in the middle. Israel is also expanding its economic relations to Turkey, which are also centered on natural gas. So, I mean, it's a very complicated situation where alliances have not yet fully crystallized, but I think it's safe to say that Cyprus is in the middle of all of this, and whether there will be peace or reunification or what have you not on the island is not really much dependent on what the two leaders are doing in New York or in Geneva, but it's part of a very grand regional bargain involving a lot of regional powers, and it's also dependent on the grand bargain between the European Union and Turkey. So I hope this gives you a brief overview of how complicated the situation is. So yeah,
Yes. Leandros, I thank you for your brief contextualization. I understand it's a very complex situation, and it's hard to do it in such short time frame. But I encourage people to go and watch the longer piece that we had done with Leandros Fischer. It'll appear on the right-hand column of your player there. I thank you so much for joining us today, Leandros.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.